Crime Scene Investigation, Lecture 10. This will cover Chapter 14, I believe, in your textbook on forensic anthropology. Go to the next slide. Forensic anthropology. Now, when decomposition of a body progresses to the stage of skeletonized remains, a forensic anthropologist may be able to, number one, establish the identity of the decedent. 2, establish the time since death. 3, determine the sex of the skeleton if the skeleton is that of an adult. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Number 4, determine the race of the skeleton. And 5, determine the stature of the person at the time of death. 6, determine the handedness of the person, whether right or left-handed. And determine the age of the person at the time of death. And 8, determine the cause of death. Let's go to the next slide. Age of a skeleton at the time of death may be determined by examining, number 1, the dentition, the teeth. Your teeth erupt at different stages of your life. And by examining the eruption of the wisdom teeth, for instance, will help establish what age you are. Also, the wear and tear of the teeth. The teeth is also a good method by which you can positively identify the individual if this individual has been to a dentist, and you can identify a dentist that may have worked on the individual if there's dental work. Suture lines on the skull. If you have the skull and at the top of the skull where the frontal bone, the right and left parietal bones come together, this is known as the fontanelle, the soft spot for babies. And I think if you've ever been around newborn babies, you can actually see a pulse from the fontanelle area. And this is where the frontal bone, the left and right parietal bones have slid on these suture lines. These suture lines are sliding lines to allow for vaginal births. Sometimes we refer to it, when a baby is born vaginally, they come out with a cone-shaped head. And this cone-shaped head is a result of the right, left, and frontal bones sliding so that it can accommodate the birth canal. And they pop back together, but after about an hour or so. But this is not uncommon with vaginal births. But the suture lines that join the right and left parietal bones and the frontal bones at the fontanelle, at the triangular area, the soft spot, will gradually grow together over a period of time or years, and that will help establish, how old was this person when they died. I had a student a few years ago, and he was in his early 20s, and his fontanelle hadn't fully fused together, and it doesn't fully fuse together till you're probably 25 years of age or older, even older sometimes. It doesn't always fuse together. And he was under a table working on a table leg or tightening or something, and there was a nail or a screw in the bottom of that table. He lifted his head up and stuck a nail into his head, and it went right into the soft spot of his head, and he said it felt like an electric shock when he did that, because the nail actually penetrated through the fontanelle and went into his brain, and he had to go have medical treatment for that, but he's okay. But anyway, the suture lines on the skull can they get tighter and tighter as you get older and older. So mine are probably really tight. Anyway. Epiphyses, these are the growth plates, and particularly in the long bones. This is the cartilage that allows the long bones to grow, and these areas don't particularly ossify or calcify with bone material until later in life. So the epiphyseal joints on the long bones is a good way to look at determine age. Osteon counting. Osteons are canals through the bone, and this is particularly useful if you have any of the long bones. When I say long bones, I'm talking about the femur, the tibia, the fibula, the humerus, the radius, and the ulna bones. These are the arm and leg bones. And if you do a cross-section of these bones, you can actually see these osteon canals going through the bone. Now, osteons live and die, and these canals provide nutrient to the bone. And the older you are, the more osteon canals you have going through your bone structure. In fact, when you're very old, you may develop what's called osteoporosis, which means brittle bones. And you have a lot of osteon canals through your bones, which would make it very easy for you to break a bone. So you can count these osteons and kind of get a good range of or definition of what the age of this person was when they died. Next slide. All right, sex can only be determined accurately by examining the adult skeleton. Puberty must have taken place. Now, this stands to reason that your body's going to go through some changes during puberty. But if you have the skeletonized remains of a child, someone who has not gone through puberty or going through puberty, then it's very difficult to determine what the sex of the skeleton is unless there's some post-mortem artifacts left with the body, such as they were in a dress or they had female clothing or male clothing on their body at the time of death. But you would have had to go through puberty, and sex is best found or determined by examining the pelvic bones. This is the innominate bone, the hip bones, and the pubic bones of the skeleton. On the pelvis bones, you can determine sex by looking at the angle of the pubic bone. This is referred to as pubic symphysis. And for females, it's more angular. It protrudes further out. And this is a result of the allowance to give birth to babies. For males, it's a shorter angle or less of an angle and not as acute of an angle in the pubic symphysis area. And also the angle of the innominate bone is wider for females. This is shown in the sciatic notch of the innominate bone. And then, again, this is for birth canal purposes or giving birth to babies purposes. On the skull, you can determine sex by looking at a bony ridge right above the eye orbits of the skull. The mastoid process, which is a little bony protrusion right behind the ear. It's longer for males, shorter or non-existent for females. The supraorbital ridge over the eyes doesn't exist for females, but it is present for males. You might see the chin being very pointed for females and very blunt for males. Also, muscle markings on the occipital bone, the backbone of the head or the neck joins. You have heavier muscle markings for males. Unless the female, if it's a female and you have heavy muscle markings on the back of the occipital bone, might indicate that this individual is a bodybuilder. So they might have heavy muscle markings. Also, the width of the palate. Females have more narrow palates. This is where you're looking at the maxilla area of the skull, of the teeth. And the females would have a much more narrow area. Males have a wider palate, and this is to allow the insertion of a foot into the mouth. I'm being facetious here, because guys are going to say something, maybe put their foot in their mouth, but they're going to have a wider palate. and also the diameter of the ball joints that you see on the femur and the humerus of the long bones of the upper arm and the upper thigh bone on the leg. The diameter of this ball generally ranges about 45 millimeters for an adult skeleton. If it's a male, about 43 millimeters for females. Of course, this is just a guesstimate because you might have big boned females and small boned males, but this is a good educated guess. Next slide. And here's a chart showing the differences of the different parts of the bones of the body, and you can see from the cranium all the way down to the feet there. But these are the bones of the body that we're referring to. Next slide. Now, race of the skeleton could be determined by examining the skull. And actually, that's the best part of the skeletonized remains to determine race, is to look at the skull. Actually, the rest of the skull, the skeletonized body, doesn't give you much information. The leg bones might give you some indication, but generally the skull is the best area to determine the race of the skeleton. Now, there's 3 basic races of man. Sometimes 4, and I'll mention this in a second. But the 3 races of man are Caucasoid, Negroid, and Mongoloid. The Caucasoid races include those that would be in the European area. The Negroid races would be those that would be located in the African area. And Mongoloid races would be those that would be located in the Asian area. Now, for the United States, we could have our Mongoloid populations would be those of Native American Indians, Mexicans, or in Latin America. Now, sometimes there's 4 races, depending on what textbook you're looking at in anthropology. A 4th race would be the Aborigine of Australia. The Aborigine have a very unique race which is directly descendant from Cro-Magnon man, but based on their DNA. But they don't really fit into the Caucasoid, Negroid, or Mongoloid group because they almost have their own separate group. They used to be, or normally would be classified as a Negroid group. However, it's not uncommon, in fact it's very common, to see blonde-haired Aborigine or red-haired Aborigine, Aborigine with green eyes, blue eyes. So these are typically Caucasoid characteristics. So anthropologists sometimes will take the Aborigine race and classify it as a separate race. Now, a nasal seal, whether it's present or absent on the skull of the decomposed body, a nasal seal is a little bony buildup of bone or a little seal that occurs right at the base of the nose. And you will see a nasal seal present with Caucasoids, and it will be absent with Negroids and Mongoloids. Now, Mongoloids would include all the your Asian type races. So the nasal seal is believed by cultural anthropologists to be an attempt to contain moisture within the nose. That you don't want the nose to lose needed moisture in the mucous canals. But anyway, shape of the eye orbits. For Caucasoids, you have an oval type shape eye orbit. Negroids tends to be a little bit oval, sometimes more round. Mongoloids is a very round eye orbit. And the purpose of the round eye orbit is to allow for the existence of the double eyelid that is present for many Asian, for all the Asian races. The reason they have, they don't have slanted eyes, they have double eyelids. And these eyelids are believed to be, by anthropologists, to be the ability to protect the eye from very strong and cold wind. Next slide. Or I'm sorry. Let me stop here a minute. Alveolar prognathism. Let's not go to the next slide. Let's finish this one. Alveolar prognathism is the protrusion of the teeth beyond the nose. And I may have to show you a video on this to demonstrate it. But if the teeth protrude further forward than the nose and chin, this is called alveolar prognathism, and that would be the result of either Negroid or Mongoloid race. If you don't have the protrusion of that alveolar prognathism, then that would be the result of a Caucasoid. And shovel-shaped incisors. Only Mongoloid races have shovel-shaped incisors. If you looked at the occlusal edge, the cutting edge of your central incisors of your teeth, then you're going to have, if you're Caucasoid or Negroid, they're going to be straight, or straight cuts. For Mongoloids, they have a U-shaped, they have a ridge built up on either side of the incisors. And again, anthropologists have surmised that this is a result of chewing skins or something to give the teeth more strength, because Mongoloid races like Native American Indians, Eskimos, and Asians would chew skins to make them softer. Again, if you believe that, fine. But that's the explanation for that. Now go to the next slide. Now here's a diagram of the skull showing the frontal, the right and left parietal, the sutures, the coronal suture and the sagittal suture lines at the top, where I was referring to earlier about where the fontanelle is. But you can see some of the anatomical landmarks on the human skull. Next slide. Here's a side view of the skull. If I was able to make a pointing picture here, I could show you the alveolar prognathism. But again, I may do that on a video for you. Now, if you'll look right behind the ear hole, where the ear would be, you'll see the mastoid process. This is this little external or extension of bone that goes behind the ear. It's much longer for males than it is for females. This would be an example of a male mastoid process because it is extending fairly downward quite a bit. And you can feel this behind your own ear. Next slide. Okay, here's a group of ETSU students that we took on a tour of the body farm. And this is Dr. William Bass standing there right behind the sign with the sunglasses on. And if you're a student at ETSU and on campus, then you may have seen me and Dr. Ellwanger. We're standing there to the right in that picture. I think Dr. Ellwanger this was his first, when he first came here, the first thing I did was take him on a tour of the body farm, and he was most impressed, to say the least. Next slide. Here's another scene at the body farm with Dr. Bass explaining what kinds of research they're conducting there. Next slide. And Dr. Bass is pointing out some of the bodies that they have laying out at the facility there to research the rate of decomposition. Some of the bodies are covered in plastic, some are just left laying open, and you can see skulls and stuff laying around this area. They also built a little shed. You can see that in the back of the picture here. where they can put bodies inside that shed to protect them from the environment, from raccoons and insect activity and stuff, and to measure their rate of decomposition under different circumstances. Next slide. Here's an individual that's partially covered with plastic. The head is exposed and the rest of the body covered with plastic. You can determine what the rate of decomposition would be for somebody in this condition. Next slide. Now here's a group of CSI students at the National Academy going through the CSI training there. And the person standing at the car that doesn't have a bunny suit on, that's Jackie Fish. Jackie is the first author of the crime scene investigation textbook. And but she was taking these students to the body farm to excavate some bodies. Next slide. Now here's one of the CSI students putting flags up around areas that would have or may have bone material or or evidence that might be at a crime scene where a body is located. Next slide. Sometimes when you're looking for dead bodies or you're searching an area where dead bodies are out in the field, the use of a metal detector would be handy. And here's one of the students using a metal detector. Metal detectors can help find weapons, shell casings, any kind of post-mortem artifact that might be associated with the body or even the perpetrator. Next slide. Here's a body that's is placed on a scale and left out to decompose. At this point, this is in probably about stage 4 decomposition, and the body is laying on a scale to provide the weight. There's also a thermal temperature gauge inside the body to measure the temperature of the body day by day, and you can see that wire sticking out of the hole there in the body. Next slide. Here's some decomposing remains. These remains are pretty much almost mummified. Go to the next slide. And here's a finger of this individual. You can see it's dried, it's leathery, but you can still determine the fingerprint. You can still see the fingerprint on the digits of the fingers. Next slide. And here's the hand of that individual. It's pretty much mummified, dried out, and you can still make out palm print and fingerprint from that individual. Next slide. Now here's probing to look for a clandestine grave or a grave that may contain a body, or if you're trying to find a buried body. These probes are steel rods sharpened at the end. Some may have a groove on the end with a T-handle on top. And what you do is you're looking for soft spots in the soil where you might have some recent soil disturbance where somebody has dug a grave, dumped a body, and then dumped dirt back on top. Then the density of the softness of that soil is going to be different from the ground that was not disturbed. So these probes help determine where your grave is likely to be. And also you may find the body in this way by when you push this rod down into the ground and then bring it back up and smell the tip, and you might smell the decomposing odor of the body. Next slide. Now, if you do find a grave and you're sifting through the soil, you want to use a screened box. This is a typical archaeological type technique. And what this student is doing is, as dirt is being removed from a grave, they are sifting through the dirt to look for any post-mortem artifacts. It could be shell casings, cigarette butts, something of that nature. Next slide. And this again shows the crime scene students roping off or zoning out the area that they're doing the excavation. This is being doing the zone search method. Next slide. Just another show here of the zone method. Now these strings, the squares is lined up, are leveled off using a line level so that you can document the location of any type of evidence you might find as you're excavating this area. Next slide. And here's an example of that line level. It's just a level, it's a bubble level that's placed onto the line. Now, brick masons use these things a lot. Next slide. All right, this is the last slide in this series, but this is showing some bones coming up as you're excavating. And of course, when you do that, you use archaeological technique to remove the dirt away from the skeletal remains. This looks like either an ulna or radius of the bone, arm bone. But you would remove that and document that through photography and measurement. Okay, that was the last slide in this series. We'll talk again.